Good morning. I hope that you are having a good holiday season so far this year. And before we begin our services this morning, I have one announcement, I guess, and one bit of information. Every year we decorate our Christmas tree with the praises of our people. And this year, not knowing if we are going to be in-person service next week or not, I thought that we would decorate our tree virtually, as we've done so many sermons. So sometime today you will see a post from me asking, to decorate our tree, and you can just do that in the comment section down below, that the community and those who are watching our services on Facebook can become more familiar with our church as they hear God's people, and hear especially God's people at Wildwood Baptist Church express exactly what God means to them, exactly what God has done for them, and why they glory in Him so much. Why we love Him, and by that love one another. And then secondly, before the sermon this morning, Christian is going to sing a couple of songs that he recorded for us this week. And then tonight as well, we will post an evening service with Brian doing a Christmas sermon. So I pray that you would take the time today to truly worship God. And as you worship God, that you would contemplate just who God is and what God has done for you, that you might decorate our virtual tree with the true praises of God, the verities of who He is, and just what we know that He has done for us. I pray that you not only enjoy our time together, but that it is worshipful, that it is meaningful, that it does precisely what the angels said it would do, that it would bring peace to us. Now, if you would, listen to Christian as he sings, "O Come, All Ye Faithful."
Sing, choirs of angels, sing in exaltation, sing, all ye citizens of heaven. Glory to God, glory in the highest. Oh, come, let us adore Him. Oh, come, let us adore Him. Oh, come, let us adore Him, Christ the Lord. All hail, Lord, we greet Thee, born this happy morning, O Jesus, for
second bit of information that I wanted to share with you this morning was to share my personal thanks with you for praying with me. Week before last, I was able to have both of my back surgeries, which was a minor miracle in and of itself. They had assumed that it would be at least 90 days out before my blood was at a sufficient level to have those, and that the hospital would have rooms and beds open for me to have them. I thank you for praying for me. I am progressing and feeling just a little bit better every day. I can already feel that I am going to get some relief from this, and hopefully over the next few months I'll be able to have that surgery on my leg and be good enough to beat all of you again in volleyball or whatever we're going to do this summer. Now, once again, listen to Christian as he sings,
I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you, oh my soul, rejoice. Take joy, my King, in what you hear. May it be a sweet, sweet sound in your ear. I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you, oh my soul, rejoice. Take joy, my King, in what you hear. May it be a sweet, sweet sound in your ear. I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you, oh my soul, rejoice. Take joy, my King, in what you hear. May it be a sweet, sweet sound in your ear.
good morning, and once again, welcome to Wildwood Baptist Church. We have spent all but very few Sundays this year in the Gospel of John, and I thought it appropriate as we spend these next couple of weeks in looking at the incarnation, at the birth of Christ, that we stay in the Gospel of John. And while you don't have the classic narrative of Luke or the fulfillment of Scripture in the narrative of Matthew, John nonetheless tells us of the glories of the incarnation and just exactly what it means that Christ became a man, that God became man. Now I want to begin today's sermon with a question. And that question is bigger always better? Oftentimes we think this way. Oftentimes we think that the only hope that we have is for something big, something magnificent, something that is beyond calculation as far as size is concerned to help us, to aid us, to guide us along the way. And the question is, first, is bigger always better? And secondly, do we properly define big? Do we properly define what is truly enormous? What is truly powerful? What is truly wonderful in this world? And so I want us to look together this morning at Genesis chapter number 1 and John chapter number 1. Now in Genesis chapter number 1, the Bible begins in the biggest possible way. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void. And darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." Now the story of God begins in the biggest possible way. The impossibility of life. The earth was without form, void, and darkness covering the face of the deep. That is not only succinct, but it is absolutely complete in its revealing of the impossibility of life. There was no form. There was nothing to have form, and there was no possibility of light because everything was darkness. And so the Bible begins in the biggest possible way. The impossibility of life being overcome by the possibility of God. That all things are possible by Him. And so the story of God begins in the biggest possible terms. God, power, light, awesomeness, creation. Let there be light. And there was light. And then you move to John 1:1, and the story of Jesus as well begins in the biggest possible way, employing the biggest possible terms. In John 1, verse number 1, we read, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of men." Where in Genesis 1 you have the impossibility of life being overcome by the power of God's Word, "Let there be light," and then life flowed from that statement. Where in Genesis 1 you have the impossibility of life, by the time you get to John 1, we find that man has fallen from that lofty created status that he had with God, that he has sinned, and that the wages of sin is death, and all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We just have to look at the world to see what a mess it is, and what a mess it is because of our activities, because of our inactivities, because of our actions, because of our attitudes. We, the cursed, have cursed the creation of God, and by that curse we we must pay the wage. We must pay the penalty of that destruction, death. Where in Genesis 1 you have the impossibility of life, in John 1 you have the inevitability of death. But just like in Genesis 1, where the impossibility of life is overcome by the possibility of God, John 1 is introducing us to the great and the glorious and the wonderful truth that the inevitability of death is overcome by this new beginning, by the new beginning of the beginning. You hear the echo of Genesis 1 here, because God is going to bring life through Jesus Christ. Genesis 1 begins in the biggest possible way, and the story of Jesus begins the same way. The biggest possible terms and ideas. God, the Word, creation, life, and light. Now, it seems to us that because of the chaos, because of the corruption, because of the way the world is, and because the way the world always has been, and because the only way we can see it being in the future, it seems to us that it has to be this way, that everything has to be big, that we need the big, we need the dramatic, we need the spectacular from God because the need is so great. It seems to us that we need the big because the need is so great, and that the forces arrayed against man are so powerful, nothing less than the biggest possible actions of God can help. We see an overview of this power that is arrayed against us in how Luke begins his gospel. In Luke 1 verse number 5 we read, "In the days of Herod, king of Judah, an Edomite sitting upon the throne of the Israelite nation, a corrupt man, and yet an incredibly powerful man who can exercise his corruption with impunity." In chapter 2, verse number 1, "In those days there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered, or that all the world should be taxed." You see the incredible power of a tyrant, of a dictator, of an emperor who cares not about the hardships that he is employing upon his people. He tells everyone that they must go to the city of their father's birth in order that a census might be taken. He doesn't care that some people may have to be away from their families or be away from their modes of income for months at a time to travel, hundreds of miles if they have moved or wandered that far away. He does not care. He is a truly uncaring dictator. His concern is only with himself, and in revealing just how great he can be. And if revealing how great he is causes great distress amongst the people, he does not care. And there is nothing that they can do about it, because he sits upon the throne of the earth and has the iron legions of Rome behind him. He can enforce compliance. And not only can he enforce compliance, he will enforce compliance. And so you see, Luke begins with two very corrupt men who will do anything to enhance their status, caring not for those around them. You move into Luke chapter 2, verse number 2. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Another of those leaders that the people really had no control over his actions, but his actions had full and complete control over them. You move to Luke chapter 3, verse number 1, and you have a list of like-minded, though lesser in scope, leaders. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonius, and Licinius, tetrarch of Abilene, during the priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. And so when we ponder the birth of Christ, we find that it is an ominous beginning. He is born into an incredibly corrupt time, into a time in which the people had no say over their lives. They had no control over their lives. They had no real hope or no real help. It's a very ominous beginning to the book. The world, the whole world, imprisoned, subservient, and doomed. It seems that there is no hope, and that there is no hope to be found. Now, Luke begins the book by listing those 7 corrupt leaders, those 7 leaders who have absolute control over the government, and then ends it in Luke 3, verse number 3, with Annas and Caiaphas, completely and absolutely corrupted leaders of the temple. A man was to be high priest 1 year once in his life. Caiaphas had spent 5 years, and then his 4 sons, and now his son-in-law is high priest. He runs the temple, runs the priesthood, much like a mafia don would run a city or run the mob. And the people were absolutely dependent upon the practices of the temple that they might worship God, but they could not worship God because of the graft imposed by these men. Their concern was not connecting men with God and men with men as ours should be, but their only concern was with the acquisition of power and money and fame and position and control. Now, with that ominous beginning, let's look at how the book ends. Luke ends his gospel with these verses. Luke chapter 23, verse number 52. And they worshipped and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. And they were continually in the temple blessing God. Now, the question inevitably arises when you look at the ominous beginning and you see such a joyful end. You see the disciples of Christ openly and joyously rejoicing and worshiping properly, worshiping God in the temple at Jerusalem. The inevitable question is, how does the book move from such expressions of despair and hopelessness and evil to joy and rejoicing? Now, in our human mind and our human understanding, we assume that surely God has deposed Herod. He has removed the title of emperor from Augustus and then Tiberius. Surely he has removed Quirinius. Surely this is what God has done. Not only has he removed the evil and the corrupted men from those positions, but undoubtedly he has put his people on the throne and permeated every level of the government with his people. And if he hasn't done that, then at least he must have replaced Annas and Caiaphas and taken control of the temple. And so the question we ask this morning is that how God brought man from despair to hope? By changing circumstance? By removing corrupted men and instituting an untarnished government? Did God move men from despair to hope, from hopelessness to joy, by changing circumstance? One would think that God is going to do or has done something big. And by big, we mean things like thunder and lightning and smiting, parting the Red Sea, calling down hailstones, calling down fire and brimstone. Is this how he did it? What is amazing is, in Luke's gospel, and I truly believe something that all Christians really need to gather into their hearts and to understand, that neither our despair nor our hope derives or arrives from men. Luke, after listing all the forces arrayed in positions of power by which they might oppose and oppress men, God doesn't deal with them. They are treated as inconsequential. Once they are listed, once they are mentioned, they are merely set aside. They are set away because they are not what either removes corruption nor brings joy. It is not a change in circumstance that takes place, but a change in position and relationship. God's answer to the problem of man is not to do something big and spectacular in the eyes of men, but it is to move from the big to the small. From those words like, let there be light, and in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. To move from the big to the small. For the Son to ask a question, and upon receiving the answer, to take a walk. God moves in His Gospels from the creation of the universe to a baby in a barn. And then for that child to grow to manhood, just the most normal thing that you can think of. A baby in a barn, that baby growing to manhood and asking his father a question and then receiving the answer, being obedient to carry it out. From the big to the small. At least as far as man reckons big and small. John 1 verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was in the beginning with God. And all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And then verse 14. And the Word became flesh. You move from that great and that awesome scene by the reckoning of man's eye in verse number 1 to a baby born in a barn in verse number 14. But understand something about 14. That baby in that barn is endowed with incredible power. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now we think in our world today that truth is not a big thing. It doesn't really matter. People don't hear it. They would rather hear and build their lives with and around propaganda. And that grace will merely cause us to lose ground rather than gain ground. But God is trying to tell us something different in how he begins the book, how he ends the book, and how he proceeds through the book. Look at John chapter 3, verse 16 and 17. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish. The inevitability of death is overcome by the presence of God becoming a baby, dwelling with us, and by truth applying grace. That whosoever believes his truth, the truth of him, should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn Caesar Augustus, to depose Herod, to declare Annas and Caiaphas corrupt. God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. He did not need to come into the world to condemn those men. Their own actions had condemned them. Their actions and the consequences of their actions were clearly seen as worthy of condemnation. That they were the cursed who lived a curse and caused even more cursing. But now here's the question that we must ask ourselves. Is there comfort in these verses? Is there peace? The world's a big place. And in it, I am very small. I'm just one man. And the power that that I may have acquired in my 50-some years seems to be nothing in comparison to the power of the forces of the movements around us that seem to be bringing greater and greater darkness, greater and greater hopelessness, taking more and more and more of our peace. Is there comfort in these verses? Is there peace? That even though the world is a big place, I am very small? Well, first let's look at the question that was asked. We said that God moved from the big to the small. And we talked about the small being the Father, or the Son, asking the Father a question, and then upon receiving the answer, being obedient. The question that this baby who grew into a man asked his father, upon facing the Father's plan for him, asks, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Asking again, he says, "Father, if there be any other way, let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done." The Son asks the Father a question. Is there any other way? And the answer given to him by the Father was, "And the angels came and strengthened him." They strengthened him to walk in from that relative safety of the garden into Jerusalem, into the very temple itself, to reveal himself, to reveal where he was staying, to let his redoubt be made known, and to leave that door open that Judas might betray him, that the soldiers might arrest him, that they might take him and illegally try him and despitefully and despicably use him, and then ultimately spit upon him and pull his beard out and say all manner of evil and lie against him, and then ultimately nail him to a cross that he might hang under the incredible indignity of the Mediterranean noonday sun. The answer of the Father was to strengthen the Son. Is there any other way that your will can be done without me taking this walk, without me enduring this shame, without me going through all of this? Now, if there's not, I'm good with it. Not my will, but your will be done. And the answer of the Father was to send his messengers to strengthen him, that he might be obedient, as Hebrews says, even to the point of death, even death on a cross for our behalf. That great passage, "A body thou hast prepared for me. In the volume of the book it is written of me, I come to do thy will." And he became obedient, even to death, even death on a cross. And you remember on that night when Jesus had revealed his redoubt, had left the door open, Judas had come through with the soldiers, that Jesus had told his disciples around that Last Supper's table, he had told his disciples to prepare themselves, that the devil had desired to have them. Now this needed to happen. And we know that it needed to happen because of the answer the disciples gave. We're ready. He had told them to prepare themselves as Jesus did, asking the Father and then waiting upon his strength. But the disciples thought that they were ready already. So Jesus allowed the devil to sift them like wheat, that they might know where their hope truly comes from. It does not, it cannot lie in man. It cannot be found in man. No matter how well intentioned, no matter how well read, no matter how long they have been walking with Christ. Our hope is in God. Our hope is in what he determines is big, what he has revealed and has planned and has worked out and has foreordained will work. And all of those men who thought they were ready, when the devil came to sift them, found them wanting. And everyone denied. The story of Peter's denial is pulled out and put on display for us. And we see him denying that he is one of his followers. We see him denying that he even knows who Christ is. And then ultimately we see him denying with curses that he does not know the man. Jesus goes to the cross. And then they finally understand what he had meant by his proclamation. He must go to Jerusalem and die and 3 days rise again. You see, the inevitability of death was a certainty to them. They did not think that it could be overcome. And Christ had told them that he was going to die and then live again, but because they thought that was an impossibility, they could not understand what he was saying. They did not understand what the metaphor meant. Why they could not understand what the metaphor meant was, it wasn't a metaphor. It was a proclamation. I will die, and I will rise again. And any who believe in me, though they die, yet shall they live. They will be mine, and I will be theirs. I will never leave them nor forsake them. Peter, upon recognizing what he thought to be a metaphor was the truth. Peter, upon recognizing his own corruption, that his name should have been alongside of Herod's and Augustus's and Philip's, that he was just as corrupt, just as weak, just as selfish, just as self-delusional as those men. When that was revealed to him through his 3-time denial during the night, he thought he had forfeited the grace of God. He now has finally understood the truth, but thinks that he is outside of the possibility of grace. And he returns to fishing. But Jesus did not call him to be a fisher of fish, but to be a fisher of men, to be a carrier of the truth and a display of a visible expression of grace. Peter goes back to fishing and finds himself a failure there again. They fish all night and they catch nothing. And Jesus goes down to the shore and calls out to them and tells them to cast their nets on the other side of the boat, like that 6 feet would matter. And their nets were so full that they could not haul them in. And they recognize that it is Jesus. They go to the beach and they find that Jesus has another supper ready for them. Their last one was not the last one. He is giving them another chance at hope. And during that meal, Jesus asks Peter to take a walk with him. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter answered, saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. But now in 21, verse number 15, after they had finished breakfast, that next meal, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And Peter answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." And you have that restoration. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, full of grace and truth. Peter understands the metaphor that he never could understand was actually truth. That death, the inevitability of death, could be overcome because God became man, became a baby born in a barn, and then lived a life in order to fulfill the will of God. And the will of God was to overcome corruption, to overcome the sentence of death with his grace. By taking that sentence and putting it upon his Son, that we might be made the sons of God. The Gospel of John begins in the biggest possible way. God, power, and light, and awesomeness. But then what we reckoned as moving from the big to the small, we understand is really the greatest and most powerful thing in the world. The grace of God by love enacted. And so the Gospel of John that begins in the biggest possible terms, because of that grace and that truth, ends in the most comforting way possible. Love and restoration and hope and meaning and tenderness. If you want to know what Christmas is, it is those words right there. Restoration. Restoration not because of the circumstances of men being changed, not because of the efforts of men, but restoration because of the love of God. And that love and that restoration giving us hope. And hope giving us meaning and purpose in life. That we who receive tenderness in a world that is scaly and hard and scarred, might by tenderness received reveal tenderness. This is Christmas. This is hope. Right? This is the story of what God has done for us. This is what is big. The Gospel of John ends this way in verse number 25. Now there were many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the scrolls that would be written. The story begins and ends the same way. The Word and God. That is the story of Christmas. That is the story of hope. That is how the impossibility of life is overcome in Genesis 1, and how the inevitability of death revealed in John 1 is overcome in John 21. The Word and God's grace. The Word, by love applied, is the greatest force in the world. Jesus applies it, and now he calls us to. That is the ringing cry and the glorious anthem of Christmas. Here is my love. Take it, receive it, and let me apply to you my life and by that love and now an understanding of my truth, apply my love in the world. It is not the Herods and the Caesars and the governors and the tetrarchs that have true power in this world. It is those of you who know me, who know my truth, have my life's blood coursing through your veins, who have my answers in your brains. The greatest force in the world is the Word of God by love applied. This is the story of Christmas. It's my hope, and not only my hope, but my purpose. It turns a dirge into an anthem of joy. And let us who know Him sing by life and by lip. This is my prayer and my hope in the glorious and loving name of Jesus Christ.